Hi, kitty cats. What follows is an excerpt from a live stream I did about how definitions of the words sex and gender derive from observations of nature. Because biology is the study of life, the words apply not just to humanity, but from single-celled organisms to plants, insects, birds, and of course mammals, of which humans are but a small part. All scientific knowledge follows directly from observation, and when we find data that contradicts our understanding of previous observations, a good scientist is willing to question the theory, not reject data for being inconvenient. So please enjoy this short explanation of how early biologists derived definitions for the concepts sex and gender. Take your Wayback Machine and imagine early biologists. Early biologists needed to classify species. This was their purpose. Biology is the study of life, and biologists observed living things so that they could develop theories about life. And initially, biologists, in looking around, separated nature first into things that appeared alive and things that appeared not alive. And so they made a definition based on observation. Alive meant observing certain behavioral patterns, such as the ability to metabolize, and the ability to grow, the ability to respond to stimulus from an environment, and conceivably adapt to said stimulus, and then also the ability to reproduce. Now, since reproduction appeared to be a primary characteristic of things that are alive, then they moved on to observe reproduction. And they separated things that could reproduce into two broad categories. There were things that reproduced with only a single parent and things that required at least two parents to reproduce. And they made another definition that single parents, parents that can reproduce with only one parent, species that can reproduce with only one parent, reproduced in an asexual manner, and species that required at least two parents reproduced in a sexual manner. I'm going to move on just to sexual reproduction. Hopefully you're okay with that. Biologists, now that they've observed this, now that they've defined this, had to ask the question, why does it take at least two parents to reproduce? And they observed, ultimately, through observation, they observed that sexual reproduction takes place through what they called gametes. I'm not going to say that much about gametes, other than they are packages of something. Today we know it as packages of genetic material, but at the time it was just packages of something that combined in order to create offspring. Biologists recognize that each gamete alone is insufficient to create offspring. There must be a combination of at least two. I'm saying at least two. Biologists observed that most species created only two types of packages, two types of gametes. This isn't universal across biology. There are some species that have more than two gametes, but for our purposes, I'm going to limit these observations of species that make only two gametes. And that's because humans appear in this category. So they made definitions, again, based on observation, to describe the two gametes. There was one that appeared relatively small and motile, able to move, and those gametes were defined as sperm. And then there were gametes that appeared relatively large and didn't move. They were stationary. They defined these gametes as ova, ovum in the singular. So they made definitions to describe the organisms that create these two gametes. Organisms that create sperm were defined as male, and organisms that create ova were defined as female. Now that's it. There you go. There's the definition of sex. Male and female, the definition of sex. You're going to notice several missing aspects from this definition. There is no mention of how the gametes work. There's no mention of genetics involved in the definition of sex. There is no mention of how the gametes are produced, which is to say that no recognition of biochemistry is involved in the definition of sex. There is no mention of how the gametes are delivered in order to be recombined. So there's no mention of anatomy involved. You may notice, ultimately, there's not even any mention of species whatsoever. Now maybe you're going to say, what's the value in this definition? Because biology is more than abstractions. Very, very true. And that's what biologists recognize. They recognize this theory of reproduction is insufficient. So biologists, after creating all of these definitions, sought to apply them to all living species. Can all organisms be assigned a designation of sex? Can all organisms be classified just into male and female? An observation of individuals within a species, they found there were species that correspond perfectly to it. Yeah, no problem. They also found species in which all individuals can create both gametes. Plants fall into this category. Many plants fall into this category. They also found species in which individual organisms can create one gamete early in life and then switch to the other gamete later in life. This is a phenomenon called sequential hermaphrodism. They found species, humans are one of them, unable to create any gametes at birth. They must wait until later in life. They have to reach what they called sexual maturity. And biologists also found individuals in all species that failed to produce any gametes whatsoever. They gave those the name sterile. And finally, interestingly enough, they found species in which individuals can create either gamete, but do so based on social pressures. And if you've watched any of my stuff for a while, you'll notice that I love to use fish. There are a couple of species in fish, and the Great Barrier Reef as a demonstration. So biologists were stuck. We're stuck in a place here. What do biologists do in this place? But you'll notice I changed my terminology. I wasn't talking about species. I was talking about individuals within a species. Species may still be classified as creating only two gametes. They can be classified as having only two sexes. But individuals within the species express those characteristics of sex based on other characteristics, based on their individual genetics and biochemistry, their individual situation in life, which could be age, it could be whether or not you had an accident, their individual situation within a social environment. So biologists needed to take the abstraction of sex as a characteristic of a species and make it individual. The word sex was clearly insufficient to cover all aspects of biology, and so they defined a new word, and that was gender, which is the combination of individual genetics, individual life situation, and individual social environment that result in the expression of the species' sex characteristics. As you see, both sex and gender are found across nature. Politicians cannot simply redefine terms to suit political expedience. If you struggle explaining these concepts to others, I hope this video serves as a resource. I've left a shortened URL in the notes to make it easier to find and remember. Talk soon. Bye.